HR, which is with their HRD services. Before we go on introducing our speaker for the evening, I would like to show an AV from our event partner. Raushad, can you please extend the host right to me so that I can share my screen?
No, you can share. You have been.
It's been disabled, sir.
You can share.
Sir, it's not allowing me to share the screen. It says disable the sharing option.
No, it is there. You know, one second, I'll just do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I can share it now, sir.
হ্যালো একটা ওয়েবিনার অ্যাটেন্ড করতেছিলাম আর হচ্ছে বাবুর ওরকম
চকলেট আপে রেজিস্ট্রি করে দেন আবার
ওই ট্রেনিং এর বাবুর তুই কি করিস
Thank you, Sharp HRD Services, for being our partner for the evening. The labor law, as the topic goes, the 3 labor codes 2020. Now, whenever it comes to labor law, it always creates a lot of grapevine and confusion among the entire fraternity, and we get to hear a lot of different kinds of views. So this is a wonderful opportunity today, and we are extremely privileged and honored to have 2 guests who are going to give us such a wonderful insight, which we all are definitely looking forward to about this particular law. So let's hear it from the horse's mouth, and I welcome Mr. Anshul Prakash, who is partner, employment, labor and benefits for Khaitan and Company. I also welcome our another speaker, Mr. Deepak Kumar, who is the principal associate, employment, labor and benefits, Khaitan and Company, and also few of their team members who are going to support us in this today's webinar. Thank you very much, the speaker. We are really honored to have you with us in today's evening, and we are lucky and privileged that you are there to enlighten us with the knowledge. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Ankita. Thank you, Rao Sahab. It's indeed a pleasure to be having the opportunity to present on these 3 labor codes. Of course, this has been there in the offing for quite some time. And to the extent we are able to cover the significant changes this law proposes to bring in, that's the intention of the presentation. Just to clarify our position on the current session, it is not intending to do a page turn of the entire law, but essentially from the perspective of looking at what exactly the law would bring in, and how and what you need to pay attention to as HR professionals from the perspective of your establishment. So that's something which we will cover for these 3 codes. And if I can just have the slides, we will start right away. The idea will be to have a 1 to 1 hour 15-minute session, and followed by Q&As. Everyone, please feel free to put in the questions in the chat box. We'll be happy to take all the questions in a more streamlined manner, bringing it up once the presentation is over.
Anshul sir, you can just unmute yourself. I have muted everyone, you know.
Sure. Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rosa. So moving on to quickly the agenda. So we have we had the code on wages 2019. HRFI was kind enough to have a session on that specifically last year. And in fact, we had 2 sessions covering 2 different locations. Apart from that, now on a more fast-paced manner in the backdrop of COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen the government moving really quickly on the other 3 consolidated labor codes, which tend to replace the existing laws in the offing. We have the news all over the media saying that the government is going to fast pace the implementation of the 3 codes, which is the Code on Social Security, Industrial Relations Code 2020, and the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code 2020, implemented by December 2020. And we should be expecting the draft rules by the central government by end of next month or beginning of November. So we are yet to see how the rules are going to play out. But moving on to the Code on Social Security 2020. So on 23rd of September 2020, the Parliament, both the Houses of Parliament, unequivocally passed the Code on Social Security. It now awaits the presidential assent and subsequent notifications of the central government. So just to clarify, no need to panic. There is no specific change which has been immediately brought in. We need to be mindful of the fact that there are certain specific procedures which ought to be followed at the government's end before we can see all these 3 codes and what I'm discussing currently, the Code on Social Security, see light of the day. So it is still in the offing. It is yet to become a law. It has just been passed by the Houses of Parliament, but awaiting the presidential assent and the notification for it to become effective, whether in full or in part. The code tends to replace the following extant statutes: the Employees Compensation Act 1923, ESI Act, EPF Act, Maternity Benefit Act, Payment of Gratuity Act, Senior Workers Welfare Fund Act, Employment Exchange Compulsory Notification of Vacancies Act, Building Other Constructions Welfare Cess Act, and the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act 2008. So we can see the specific approach which the government has taken to substitute all these plethora of laws which we have on the same subject matter being replaced by a particular consolidated statute, which will be a code covering all these aspects. Moving on to the next slide. So we have the important changes in the definitions. I think the most important part being definition of wages, and almost the entire HR professionals fraternity has been struggling with multiple definition of wages all across different statutes from a labor law standpoint in this country. The only welcome change which I can see from a definitional standpoint is that the wage has been defined uniformly all across. It takes is true from the Code on Wages 2019, which is uniformly covering the overall perspective of inclusive definition of wages, which includes basic salary, DNS allowance, medical allowance, and education allowance. And of course, it also tends to exclude HRA and conveyance allowance. However, it says for the purposes of contribution under the EPF Act, ESI Act, and for the purposes of defined benefit, which is gratuity, the base pay which is going to be considered is going to be the minimum, which is 50% of the total remuneration. So as you see on the slide, if we have the total remuneration being 20,000, but your inclusive wages is less than 50% of the total remuneration, then you do not need to have any restructuring done. Only for the purposes of this definition, which when it comes to computation for EPF, ESI, and gratuity, you need to just take the differential amount and add it to the inclusive part. So right now, if you see the total is 9,000, you need to bring in the additional 1,000 from the excluded component and add it over there. So that's something which the law intends us to do. It is not really calling for an immediate restructuring of your wage structures. Of course, in terms of the impact on contributions, it may be limited for the industry because the wage ceiling as a concept continues to exist. So for almost all the industries, the appropriate government is going to specify the wage ceiling for the application of the relevant chapters. So, for example, Rao Sahib, I'm sorry, there's some disturbance
Hello,
in between.
there's someone. Yeah.
1 second. I'll just.
Can we disconnect these type of people who have no respect for others?
Yeah,
Yeah, I have muted everyone now. Yeah.
Rao Sahib, go ahead and disconnect that person who is disturbing us. Please.
Yeah, sir, carry on. I have muted everyone.
No problem. I think it's the new normal. So let's just carry on. So what I was trying to emphasize upon is that currently under the EPF Act, there is a wage threshold or wage ceiling of 15,000 rupees per month. If an employee is earning below that particular threshold, he ought to be compulsorily covered. And of course, for somebody who is earning way beyond that threshold, it is going to be up to that wage ceiling. It is not compulsory for you to continue to pay beyond that threshold. So that same logic or the same structure is continued to be applicable. Of course, we are yet to see if at all there is going to be a change in the threshold which the appropriate government, which is the central government, which may prescribe for both EPF and ESI. Important changes in the other definition is essentially the employee. For the purposes of coverage, unlike what we have for the ESI Act currently, you need to count in all the employees taken together in terms of number. So currently, for example, the ESI Act says, at least for the commercial establishments, that you need to have employees within that threshold, which is 10 currently for commercial establishments, to be covered as an establishment who are earning within that threshold, which is prescribed, which is currently INR 21,000 rupees per month. Unlike ESI Act as it's reached today, the Code on Social Security for ESI purposes has made it very clear that it is only the numerical threshold and not the wage ceiling which is going to be material. So the moment you have 10 or more employees on your payroll, including your contract workers, you need to immediately go for coverage under the ESI Act. And then, of course, you will move towards who all are going to be covered from a wage ceiling standpoint when it comes to ESI contributions. For EPF, it is the same. It is 20 or more in terms of coverage. And then you have to move forward and see who are going to be compulsorily covered from contribution standpoint. And that threshold may be increased. It may be static when it comes to the threshold which is going to be prescribed in terms of wage ceiling by the appropriate government. Of course, without the sense of reputation, inclusion of contract workers for the purpose of threshold has been retained. It has been made absolutely clear that if you have 5 employees on payroll, but you have other 10 employees as contract workers, you need to include them. Of course, it will be having a negligible impact on the overall contributions because the provisions in terms of recovery from the contractor for any contribution which you make for those contract workers will continue. There is certain degree of lack of clarity in relation to gratuity because as a principal employer, if you pay gratuity for the contract workers, if the immediate employer fails to make that payment, the very concept of recovery of dues of that nature sorry. Just to emphasize and clarify again, in terms of gratuity only, there is a lack of provision when it comes to recovery of gratuity amounts from the immediate employer or the contractor. So we may have to see how the clarity is going to be brought in. If at all the principal employer is required to pay gratuity in the event of immediate employer failing to pay gratuity to his employees. Another important aspect is about fixed term employment. So that has been recognized. Treatment in terms of wages and benefits will be at par for the fixed term employees. Benefits which will be ordinarily applicable to your regular employees is something which will continue to apply to your fixed term employees. And the only definitional attribute here is when employment would entail a fixed term. That's something which is going to be applicable for a fixed term employee. So the contract has to be very clear. If there is an end date which has been provided for, the employee will continue to have all the benefits apart from the fact that which is applicable to the other employees. So it is all prorated for the fixed term employees in your company. Moving on to the next slide. Another important change is about voluntary opting in and opting out of EPF and ESI framework. So for EPF, it remains the same.
Hello, request you to host. Please unmute, sorry, mute to all participants.
Sir, kindly unmute the gentleman who is making us disturbance.
Let's carry on.
Please carry on, sir.
Right. So to quickly move on to the next point about the other important changes. The voluntary opting in and opting out is not in terms of individual employees. So it's not the case that the moment an employee is essentially moving into a threshold which is higher than the minimum wage ceiling, then that person will have the necessary option to move out of the scheme. That's not the intention here. When we say voluntary opting in and opting out of EPF, it is essentially when majority of the employees, and especially from ESI standpoint, if you want to cover those employees who are also, way beyond the minimum statutory wage ceiling, you can get yourself covered and cover your employees under the ESI scheme, which is not currently available to establishments, and you then have to see for alternate ways of covering your employees from medical benefits perspective. So that is something which has been brought in as voluntary opting in. It has not yet been clarified in what circumstances you can continue to opt in and opt out, but we would assume that voluntary opting in and opting out is something which is largely a one-time aspect. We are yet to see if any of the rules are going to have more clarity for the establishments with the frequency in terms of majority of employees agreeing to opt in or opt out of a particular scheme, provided majority of the employees are going to earn the salary which is way beyond the ceiling which is going to be prescribed by the appropriate government. Another important point here is about differential rates of employees' share of Provident Fund contribution. So that's something which is going to be a very important change. And when I say differential rates for employees' contribution, doesn't mean that the employees will have their own option. The government, the appropriate government, is going to come up and create different classes of employees, and different rates are going to be prescribed for those employees. So that's something which is for us to consider, because the objective here is, and underlying intent here is, that while the employer contribution rate is going to be constant, which is going to be between 10 and 12%, or as the case may be prescribed by the appropriate government, for employees, it may vary, which may bring in the aspect of higher take-home pay for certain categories of employees. So that's something which has been brought in, largely inspired by the COVID-19 pandemic, where employees, more than the future, are more concerned about their current prospects for running their households. Another important point is about the ESI paying the benefits or bearing the benefits for an employee who is covered under the ESI scheme, because the employer has failed to make those payments or contributions. There is a concept of recovery of capitalized value of benefit. We are yet to see how these definitional attributes are going to be elaborated upon under the rules, as and when these are going to be brought in or implemented. So the overall concept of capitalized value of benefit, or the equivalent value of default which has been committed by an employer, will be prescribed under the rules. One important change about interstate migrant workers is about the wage ceiling of 18,000 having been introduced instead of the current wage ceiling which is there under the Interstate Migrant Workers Act. And it is expanding the scope not just for the contract workers or workers who have been engaged through third-party contractors being brought in from a different state for rendering services in another state, but it is also about regular employees being brought in from another state for rendering services as permanent employees of the establishment. So that's something we need to really watch out for. how the rules are going to bring in your liabilities or your responsibilities as an immediate employer from the perspective of an interstate migrant worker, not just who is engaged through a third-party contractor, but also who is a regular employee on your payroll. We are yet to see who is going to be categorized as an interstate migrant worker as a regular employee, because you may have people who have been there domiciled in a particular state for several years now. So what should be the criteria to categorize a worker as an interstate migrant worker from a permanent employee standpoint? We are yet to see once the rules are going to see light of the day. Another important point is about provisions of gig workers and platform workers. The only definitional change we are seeing here and recognition of gig workers is those workers who are engaged through beyond the traditional ways of employment or traditional ways of engaging with employees. So there is no further elaboration. Of course, it tends to elaborate on the point that for aggregators, for intermediaries who are essentially looking at the perspective of engaging personnel from an intermediary standpoint and not direct employees, that concept is now covered, but we are yet to see if at all there is going to be any expanded definition of gig workers. Of course, the overall concept of contribution towards insurance fund and insurance benefits for these gig workers and platform workers has been introduced. The aggregators will be legally mandated to contribute towards at the rate of 1 to 2% of their annual turnover towards this insurance fund. So it does not necessarily mean that if you are taking services from an aggregator pertaining to the gig workers, then you are going to be liable for their wages, etc. It is only from the perspective of contribution by the aggregators at the rate of 1 to 2% of their annual turnover. So we will see how the rates are going to be prescribed and elaborated upon from the rule standpoint as and when the government is going to formulate those. From a payment of maternity benefit perspective, the upper limit of medical bonus has been done away with. Currently, under the Maternity Benefit Act, it is rupees 20,000. And what has been prescribed currently by the appropriate government is rupees 3,500 in cases where the employee may not be covered under the ESI Act or ESI scheme. In certain cases where you're not providing pre or postnatal confinement for your female employees, medical bonus can be paid. Availing common creche facility from a third-party service provider or setting up of one common resource pool for this purpose has been recognized at a central level. Important point for considering by all the HR professional, by the companies here is that now there is a limitation which has been prescribed for initiating inquiries in terms of determination of amounts, if at all that it is found out that any employer has defaulted for contributions under the EPF and ESI chapters. So it has now been limited to 5 years. It will not be the case anymore as and when the act is going to be implemented and coming into force along with the rules, that there could be roving inquiries and the concerned authorities can ask for records which may run back to 12 to 14 years or even 15 years in the past. So that has now been limited to 5 years. Of course, the law currently also stipulates composition of or compounding of offenses punishable only with fine or imprisonment for up to 1 year. We are yet to see how compounding of offenses, which is not a concept under the current statutory regime, is going to be brought forward. There is no criteria which has been brought in. The process has not yet been stipulated under the code, and probably what we will see is going to be the rules which will essentially prescribe the compounding mechanism. Last but not the least, about the career sentence and compulsory notification of vacancies. So the current threshold of 25 or more employees for any establishment to file the returns in terms of any vacancies being currently there, that has fallen away. There is no threshold, so each establishment will be required to file the necessary returns as may be prescribed, and career centers will be established for potential candidates or employees to look for or explore opportunities for employment with potential employers. Moving on to the next slide. So I will have my colleague Deepak quickly cover the preface to the Industrial Relations Code, and then we can take over the larger part of the slides. Deepak, over to you.
Thank you, Anshul. So Industrial Relation Code is also the second most significant code that has been approved by both houses of the parliament, along with the other two codes on 23rd of September. And along with the other two codes, it again awaits a presidential assent. This code is largely drafted to replace the three important statutes, which is the Trade Unions Act, Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act, as well as the Industrial Disputes Act. Most of it are relevant across the board for all establishments, particularly large-scale establishments which are engaged in manufacturing activities, and also this covers to other establishments and commercial establishments, and clarifies a lot of points with respect to applicability of standing orders as well as union activities. Next slide. So in terms of important changes in the definitions which have been introduced under the IR code, the first and foremost being the definition of industry, which has been overhauled, and it has been defined to mean any systematic activity which is carried on by cooperation between employers and workers for production, supply, distribution of goods with a view to satisfy human wants, other than spiritual and religious purposes. So the industry definition has been overhauled to a large extent. Of course, the profit remains immaterial, but certain establishments which are wholly and substantially engaged in charitable and social philanthropic services have been given an exclusion from the definition of industry. The definition of workers excludes persons engaged in supervisory capacity and who draw wages exceeding 18,000 per month. This is a significant increase that has happened over the definitions which we have been seeing in terms of exclusion of supervisors previously under the Industrial Disputes Act, which had the limit up to INR 10,000. Further, the strike definition of strike, it also includes concerted casual leave on any given day by 50% or more workers. So in case there have been instances previously where employees go on en masse leave, and that itself of more than 50% people going on a concerted casual leave could also be covered under definition of strike. This is something, it's a more welcome inclusion based on the industry feedback. Next is the definition of wages. The revised definition of wages has been kept in line with the definition included in the other codes. This is uniform. And the threshold of 50% level and maintaining overall remuneration of the non-excluded component continues to apply in this code as well. An important implication that this will have is while computing retrenchment compensation while terminating workmen in that case. So this aspect of 50% of the salary level to be maintained for the purposes of computing wages under the IR code is something that we will have to be mindful of and ensure that the balance between the excluded components and the included components remains as such. The next aspect, if we go on to the next slide. Now we'll discuss the key changes, and handing over back to Anshul to discuss the key changes introduced in the industrial code.
Thank you, Deepak. So I think one of the few aspects which all the establishments, especially on the commercial or services side, have been struggling with, they need to rely upon state-specific orders and notifications for them to be covered under the Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act. And of course, there are certain thresholds which have been prescribed under the IESA. So now the Industrial Relations Code intends to cover all commercial establishments under this code who are having 300 or more workers engaged at any point in time. So you don't have to really rely upon the state government notifications or any notification under the applicable Shops and Commercial Establishments Act for you to be covered under the ISA. There is a concept of deemed certification of standing orders, which has been brought in. Of course, there is going to be a prescribed timeline. So if you apply to the competent authority as prescribed under the rules, applicable rules, and if there is a delay in terms of receiving the certification, deemed certification concept has been introduced. Another important aspect here is about the falling away of overlapping dispute resolution mechanisms. I think the only significant change when it comes to dispute resolution mechanism is that the concept of a labor court versus an industrial tribunal tends to fall away. Under the Industrial Disputes Act, when we look at the relevant schedule, labor court and industrial tribunal have overlapping powers when it comes to the aspect of unlawful termination being brought in as a concept of industrial dispute by any workman. So that is something which is intended to be done away with. But that's something which we need to consider, because as such, the provisions which are currently applicable for looking at any industrial dispute continue to apply. It is the case that any worker or employer who is aggrieved or wants to raise any industrial dispute will have to approach a conciliation officer, followed by the process of either the matter being referred in case of failure of conciliation to the industrial tribunal, instead of referring it to a labor court as such, because that will fall away completely. Or it can be the aggrieved party which can directly approach the industrial tribunal for the adjudication of industrial dispute in case there is a failure of conciliation process. So you will have to wait for conciliation process to get over, but of course there is a timeline which has been prescribed. So from the date when the order is going to come in of any conciliation process, there is a 90 days timeline which has been provided for a party to approach the industrial tribunal for adjudication, instead of the 45 days cooling off period which is currently mentioned under the Industrial Disputes Act. Another important, or I would say significant step which has been taken by the legislature to bring in some labor reform from a trade union or strike standpoint is that the entire concept of sending advance notice of a strike, which was earlier applicable only in case of public utility service establishments, has now been extended to all establishments. So for any trade union to call strike, you have to provide for advance notice, irrespective of whether your establishment falls within the domain of a public utility service. From the perspective of seeking prior approval of the appropriate government in case of retrenchment, it is still applicable only to factories, mines, and plantations. So we need to be mindful of the fact that there is no change when it comes to the entire perspective of seeking prior approval to retrench workers. It is still applicable only to factories, mines, and plantations, and not to commercial establishments. Of course, the threshold of 100 or more workers has now been increased to 300 workers, and this is something which cannot be reduced by any state legislature. So it can be increased, but it cannot be reduced. So it will remain constant all throughout the country. So right now, currently, when you face this situation of determining the number of workmen at state levels across the country, and you have looking at different kind of thresholds, that problem hopefully will be resolved. It will only be a higher threshold and not a lower threshold as prescribed here. Another important point which has been introduced is about contributions by the employers to a reskilling fund for every retrenched worker, but it is not going to be in case of closure of establishment. It is only in cases where a worker has been retrenched. So in those cases, you need to make certain contributions, and we are yet to see how the rules are going to be framed in that regard and what is going to be the appropriate procedure for it, and how the reskilling fund is going to be constituted. So that's something we are yet to see, but this concept has been brought in that in case you retrench any worker in terms of retrenchment simpliciter, but not because of closure, that concept has been brought in. Recognition of trade union is another important point which has been recognized because earlier it was limited to only certain states like Maharashtra, which had state laws pertaining to recognition of trade union as the negotiating trade unions. And most of the time you would see multiple trade unions fighting for their rights to negotiate with the management in case of charter or demands being floated or offered. So at the central level, for the first time, this concept has been introduced. There are certain thresholds which have been prescribed under the code, which tends to recognize the right of majority membership or majority percentage trade union being recognized as the sole negotiating trade union in case you have multiple trade unions operating on your premises. So it's not just about a registered trade union, it's about minimum 51% of membership of workers being attributed to a particular trade union for it being entitled to become a sole bargaining agent on behalf of the employees it controls. Moving on to very quickly, digitalization of procedures is something which we are going to see in the future, how these procedures are going to be simplified. Another important point is about the compounding of offenses. So we are going to see in the rules how compounding is going to be an allowed sort of a process. But of course, it does currently provide about 50% of the total fine which is payable for any offense which is punishable only with fine, up to 3/4 of the fine which can be paid, and offense can be compounded by the competent authority if any particular offense carries the punishment of imprisonment up to 1 year or with fine or both. So that's in a nutshell about the key changes. Moving on to the next slide. So very quickly, I'll hand over to my colleague Deepak to cover the OSH Code 2020.
Right. Thank you, Anshul. The next code is the Occupational Health and Safety Code. This was again also introduced along with the two codes, which is IR Code and Social Security Code. This, in fact, replaces a lot of almost 12 to 13 extant statutes and merges the provisions in respect of all these statutes together and brings them all into one. Of course, the primary and the more important one being the Factories Act, the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act, the Interstate Migrant Workers Act are the key legislations that have been merged in the OSH code. Next slide. Now, the important definitions that have been introduced and included in the OSH code is something, we'll again start with the definition of the workers first up. The definition of workers under the Factories Act did not have a specific carve out for managerial and supervisory categories, which has now been included and given an exclusion under the definition provided under the OSH code. Again, the definition remains harmonious with the other two codes, which is the Social Security and IR code, and it excludes the managerial and supervisory employees. Supervisory employees who draw wages in excess of 18,000 per month are also excluded from the definition of workers under the OSH code. Further, the definition also includes contract workers, which is a departure from the position which is there currently under the Factories Act 1948. Now, coming on to the next definition of a factory, there have been a lot of state amendments where the thresholds, different thresholds were applicable in different states for applicability of a factory's license. So a factory has now been defined to uniformly to, and the threshold on the number of workers has been increased from 10 to 20 for factories running with aid of power, and from 20 to 40 in case of factories which do not run with aid of any power. A new concept of core activity of establishment has been introduced. Unlike in the 2019 code, this is a new concept which has been included in the 2020 code itself. The relevance of this is in relation to engagement of contract labor. It explains that an activity for which an establishment has been set up, including an activity essential or necessary, would be considered as a core activity. And to provide for further guidance on this concept, the 2020 code also sets out certain activities which would be considered as non-core activity unless an establishment has been set up to carry out such activity. So the concept of core activities in relation to Contract Labor Act, and that was always subject to question and dispute as to in which functions or which categories can an employer engage contract workers and for which function it is essential that it has to have permanent employees on its roll performing those functions. So the 2020 OSH code tries and brings some clarity and a uniformity across on this concept. It further goes on to stipulate that engagement of contract labor in core activity shall be prohibited. Having said that, there are carve-outs and there are exceptions which are more practical and oriented in nature, which allows for exceptions to this rule in case where engagement is to aid the normal functioning, or to in case of any sudden increase in the volume of core activity that needs to be done, or any immediate need of manpower. So there are exceptions which are provided for engagement of contract labor in core activities, but it again tries to bring a sense and harmony across this concept, which has been subject matter of various interpretations and a lot of confusion amongst the industry and across states. The next aspect is the change in definition of the industry. Industry now has new inclusions. Organizations included under charitable, social, and philanthropic services and any other activities notified by the central government will be excluded from industry. It again goes back and relates, is in sync with the definition provided under the IR code. Interstate migrant workers, there's a very subtle change in the definition of interstate migrant workers, which now includes employees which are directly recruited by an employer from another state, subject of course to wage ceiling of 18,000, and it is not just limited to interstate migrant workers that were hired through contractors. The next aspect is on the definition of on the occupier itself, that who will be an occupier in case of a factory. There have been a lot of confusion under the Factories Act previously. The extant provision states that in case of a company, any one of its directors can be considered as occupier in case if somebody is not named specifically. This, of course, in case of listed companies and large-scale manufacturing operations, raised an issue as to whether independent directors can be considered or will be construed as occupiers in case if nobody has been specifically notified. In line with the previous advice that we have been advising clients, that independent directors are somebody who are not involved in day-to-day management and therefore should not be brought in within the ambit of occupier under the Factories Act. And this is something which has been clarified under the OSH Code 2020 and specifically stated that independent directors will not be deemed as an occupier under the OSH Code. So this is another welcome clarification which has been introduced in the OSH code. Moving on to the next slide, where we'll discuss key aspects and key changes which have been brought in by the OSH code. Handing over back to Anshul.
Thank you, Deepak. So very quickly, and we are mindful of the time, we are just 10 minutes to go before we look into the questions. So effectively, in terms of the coverage, if you are an establishment and not just a factory or any manufacturing process being carried out in your establishment, OSH code tends to cover any establishment which has 10 or more employees or workers, for that matter, engaged on your premises. There is a concept of deemed registration which has been brought in, similar to what we have seen in the past, in the past few slides. So we are yet to see what is the timeline which will be attached for this process. But of course, the appropriate government in terms of setting out the rules and appointing the competent authorities for registration purposes will be the state government. So we will have to see and rely upon not just the central government rules in this regard, but also the rules which will be framed by respective state governments under the OSH code. So this is something which may see some delays when it comes to the rules being framed by respective state governments. Of course, there are certain formalities which have been clearly prescribed and associated with closure of establishment, not just a factory, but also from the perspective of extension of duties for employers when it comes to maintaining health and safety of their workers. So it is important for us to consider not just from the perspective of local shops and commercial establishments Act, which will continue to be in force. And just to clarify, OSH code is not meant to substitute the state specific shops and commercial establishments Act. We are yet to see if at all this code is going to impact any local state legislations, but yes, there will be additional requirements under the code for employers all across sectors. There will be a prior consent requirement for overtime. So you cannot just force employees to work overtime. You have to bring in certain records. There will be an element of evidence, which will be the requirement. We are yet to see in terms of overtime thresholds and caps. The only thing which we see in terms of work time regulations under the OSH code is for a factory and for establishment, it prescribes maximum 8 hours as work time. And beyond that, when it comes to any statutory cap, quarterly cap or weekly cap for overtime purposes, that is yet to be seen, and the appropriate government is going to prescribe that. There is a revised threshold for creche facility for a factory. And of course, the definition of factory, as Deepak has just mentioned, has been expanded in terms of the numerical threshold. But when it comes to the creche facility for a manufacturing establishment, which is currently 30 or more, it has now been increased to 50 or more. And it says more than 50, in fact, when it comes to the creche facility being there on manufacturing establishments. Of course, it does recognize the concept of a common creche facility. So in terms of rules, we are yet to see how things pan out. But this is something which has been introduced. There is an increase in threshold for application of chapter which relates to contract labor, essentially related to the increase in threshold, which is currently 20 in some states, 50 in some states, 10 in some states, and in fact, Telangana has the least threshold, which says 5 or more contract workers for the CLRA Act to become applicable to you. So at least at the central level, the government now intends to have a uniform threshold, numerical threshold for the contract labor implications to apply to you, which will be 50, and no state government or state legislature will have the power to legislate and bring it down to a lesser number than what has been prescribed under the code. So from the contract labor standpoint, you have to rely upon any higher threshold, but don't have to worry about any lower threshold being prescribed. Another aspect is about the concept of deemed employment for contract workers engaged through any unlicensed contractor. So which was previously incorporated in the code, which was brought in by the government for deliberation last year. Now that concept has been done away with. So even if you have an unlicensed contractor, it is not going to be the case that the contract workers engaged through a contractor who is not having a valid license under the OSH code will automatically have a right to claim regular employment with the principal employer. Of course, there are certain changes in provisions related to interstate migrant workers. We have already covered that point, so I will not repeat it in terms of the processes. Digitalization of procedures is something which we will see how easy it will become in terms of doing business, and how easy it would be in terms of making all the processes facilitated online. Compounding of specific offenses, we will have to see how the rules are going to be framed and stipulated in that sense. So that is something which we should be relying upon the rules to be framed. So largely the only perspective which is important here is about the power given to the appropriate government to specify certain exemptions for establishments in case there is a situation akin to that of a pandemic. So the only concept which we can see which has been taken in the backdrop of COVID-19 is that the government can take appropriate measures to exempt certain classes of establishment from the application of OSH code in case of a pandemic. Unfortunately, the government has unable to look at or bring in the concept of work from home, which may be the new norm specifically for the service sector establishments when it comes to looking at very important aspects of health and safety when the employees continue to work from the confines of their home or any other remote location. So that's something which has not yet been encapsulated or incorporated. Could have been the case and would have been a better proposition for the government to consider that work from home as a concept, but that's something which is lacking. I think with that, we end the presentation, largely covering all the significant aspects, and we are happy to look at the questions now which are there in the chat box.
So, Anshul sir, we have collected a few questions. So the first one is, will the principal employer have any obligation to make contributions towards worker reskilling fund in case of retrenchment?
So first of all, we have to understand the dichotomy between two establishments. And there is no automatic right or requirement which will immediately bring in, because the code as such, from an industrial relations code standpoint, it does not tend to include a contact worker. So when it comes to the process of retrenchment to be followed, that process, when it comes to the immediate employer, will be limited to the contractor itself. So if tomorrow there is a retrenchment which will be carried out by the contractor, because, for example, if you as a principal employer would like to terminate a services agreement, the process of contribution towards reskilling fund will be limited to the immediate employer and not the principal employer. So that is very clear in terms of inclusion, or I would say exclusion, which has been brought about by the code in terms of absolute clarity.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, if an employee is not engaged in supervisory capacity but earns wages more than 18,000 rupees, will Industrial Relations Code apply to him or her?
No, of course. So I think the code as it reads today does not tend to make a kind of a very substantial change to the definition of a workman. You call them a worker now. You used to call them workmen under the Industrial Disputes Act. The salary threshold will not have any bearing, except the fact that somebody may be engaged in supervisory capacity and earning 18,000 or less per month. If somebody tends to earn more than that amount but is not engaged in a supervisory capacity or managerial capacity, in that case the person will be deemed to be a workman. So I think the essential test of the substantial duties of an employee will continue to remain even under the Industrial Relations Code.
All right. Also, as we discussed with respect to applicability of the chapter on standing orders, that it is going to apply where there are 300 or more workers. So in case of smaller establishments where you don't have the requisite number of workers, which law would govern service conditions?
Of course. So as it happens today, so for example, in certain states for a commercial establishment to which the Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act will not specifically apply, there are several establishments who take cue from how the model standing orders would read. And of course, from the perspective of maintaining propriety on how those employees are going to be governed, you may have internal rules framed. So the law, and I would say from a judicial perspective, when it comes to an industrial tribunal looking at the service rules of an organization, may not necessarily rely upon standing orders if at all the law would not apply to you. But it is always advisable to continue to frame your own internal policies which will govern your employees when it comes to any disciplinary process or other service conditions. And of course, the contractual stipulations will continue to apply for each individual employee nevertheless.
Understood. So we have received one common question from a couple of participants, which is who is going to be considered as an aggregator under the Code on Social Security? Is there any guidance under the code?
Sure. So I think in terms of the definition of an aggregator, the only perspective here is somebody who is utilizing the services of individuals and carrying out a relationship which is essentially beyond the traditional means or traditional methods of employment. There is not much detail which has been provided for under the code. But essentially, I will take an example of cab aggregators, e-commerce aggregating sites, which may not have a relationship per se with those workers. They may be carrying out duties which are within certain parameters, but those duties are being carried out with certain degree of independence involved. So aggregators largely, you can say, without taking any names, the cab aggregators or e-commerce aggregators of today who may provide certain platforms, and you have people who are working for those platforms may not be sharing a traditional employment relationships, but yes, following certain guidelines for you within those parameters. So we are yet to see if the rules are going to clarify it further, but that's how an aggregator would look like from a definition standpoint.
Also, sir, if I could add here, within the code itself, there is a schedule appended which lists out certain categories who would be considered as aggregators. So ride-sharing services have been expressly recognized as aggregators. And then there is a general a clause within the schedule that says that the government can include any other services also within the ambit of aggregator. So we, as you said, we are yet to see more clarity on that, but certain categories have been expressly identified, including e-commerce companies.
Right.
So, sir, the other question is, so if you would see the state of Karnataka, it has exempted IT/ITES establishments from standing orders rules. So one question is whether such exemptions will continue under the new framework?
Yes, to that extent, if we are looking at the central government and appropriate, the state and central governments becoming the appropriate governments for different categories of establishments, the model standing orders may continue to apply. But of course, when it comes to any specific exemptions being granted, apart from banking, telecom and insurance companies, under the Industrial Relations Code, also the appropriate government will be the state government. So to that extent, you may see certain exemptions being granted on a very case-to-case basis. We may see rules being framed by the appropriate state governments under the Industrial Relations Code. So that's something which we are yet to see. But yes, there is a possibility that these exemptions may continue to apply. But of course, I would like to emphasize here that the idea is to bring in or expand the ambit of the code to the extent possible across sectors, including service sector establishments. But we have to see on a case-to-case basis if we are looking at any kind of exemptions being granted.
Understood. So, sir, we also discussed the concept of fixed-term employment in our presentation, and we observed that under Industrial Relations Code, the definition of fixed-term employment includes a condition that the person, the employee, fixed-term employee, must complete 1 year of service in order to avail gratuity. But if you see the code on Social Security, the definition of fixed-term employment does not contain that stipulation. So how should we reconcile? Should we then assume that as far as gratuity entitlements are concerned, a fixed-term employee must complete 1 year of service in order to claim it?
So I have to say that, of course, the dichotomy will continue to exist. Probably it's more of an oversight on the part of our legislators, because we have two separate codes dealing with two separate subject matters. One which is specifically covering the point of social security, which includes gratuity, and the other code which is about industrial relations, identifying or recognizing the concept of fixed employment, but carrying out a specific service tenure for the purpose of gratuity entitlement. We may have to marry both the provisions together, and in the longer run, if at all there is going to be a judicial test to it, we will have to see about that. Or if there is going to be a clarification from the government, probably we may have to look out for that. But as of now, I can only say that probably from a gratuity standpoint, we may have to read the provisions together.
Right. Another related question with respect to fixed-term employment. Now, there are certain jurisdictions where there are restrictions as to who could be employed as a fixed-term employee. So in certain countries, you have a prohibition with respect to the number of renewals that you can have with respect to fixed-term contract. And in some countries, you also have guidance as to which kind of tasks can be, for which kind of tasks you can engage a fixed term employee. So are there any restrictions in Indian law with respect to who can be employed as a fixed term employee?
So there is no restriction as such. And of course, there are, we will have to look at the judicial precedents also in this regard, because the very concept of fixed term employee has not been undermined by the judiciary. And of course, the code also for the first time does recognize, and it moves beyond the Standing Orders Act, which was the only law which recognized fixed term employment. So we will have to see if at all there is going to be a condition attached to it or qualifications attached to it. But largely, I would like to emphasize that a fixed term employment as a concept may be applied in cases where you have project-based employees or employees who are tasked with certain specific responsibilities. It may be the case that you are into public-private participation projects. You may have project-based employees who are only engaged for a certain period of time. And once that project is completed, the person is going to move out. So largely it is based on the contractual stipulation, on the kind of duties and responsibilities attached to it. But no prohibition per se has been prescribed when the concept or the recognition which has been accorded to fixed term employment as a term under the codes.
Understood. So there is one question that some of the participants have asked, which is what happens to MRTO Act, which is applicable to Maharashtra? Is it going to be subsumed under the code?
No, so we have to be mindful of the fact that labor as a subject can be legislated upon both by the central and state legislatures, and it runs still runs into the concurrent list. The only fact here is that for those states which do not recognize, or I would say do not follow the concept of recognition of trade unions, will have to now follow that process. As I have given an example about Maharashtra, which already recognizes the concept of recognition of trade unions, probably we'll have to see if at all there is going to be a forbearing impact of how the trade unions had been substituted by the Industrial Relations Code is going to be something which impacts the MRTU PULPAT's application on trade union recognition concept at the state level. But it's not going to be the case that anything and everything which currently legislate upon that concept of recognition is going to be absolutely substituted from a state legislation standpoint. Deepak, if you want to add anything on that front, feel free to do so. No problem. I think we can move on. We can move on. I think there was some disturbance. So next question, Diksha, sorry.
Yes. So the other question is, do the codes provide any guidance as to the time period beyond which, if a contract worker is engaged, he or she can claim permanency?
No, so there is no, and Diksha, feel free to add if you have any inputs on that, but there is no specific criteria which has been prescribed. Of course, you need to follow the process of registration, licensing, etc. The entire test of supervision and control will continue to apply the way it was under the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act. So it's not going to be the fact of how many years a person has spent as a contract worker on your premises. But of course, be mindful of the fact that the very perspective of core activity of the establishment has now been clarified. And there are only few relaxations which you need to bring on record to establish the fact as to why you needed so many contract workers for carrying out any activity regular workers. So in that case, probably we can draw some inference as to where the law is coming from. If at all the contract workers would tend to claim permanent employment with the principal employer, if they're engaged in activities which can be said to be core activities of the establishment.
Understood. So I think one of the participants has also commented that there is a timeline of 240 days. And if you have been engaged for that amount of time in an establishment, the contract worker can actually go ahead and claim permanency on that basis. So I think we have already clarified that point. First of all, even under the present framework, there is no automatic regularization. If at all the contract workers have to claim permanency, they will have to approach the government, and it's then the prerogative of the government to consider a number of factors on the basis of which they will pass an order regularizing or rather abolishing the contract labor in a particular establishment. So there is no automatic regularization even today.
Yes, absolutely. So this 240 days is not sacrosanct, and that's the reason why I didn't bring it up, because this entire perspective of rotation of contract workers from time to time is something which is always applied as a formula by majority of establishments. And please be mindful of the fact that the same logic will continue to apply. It's not about the face which you like, it's about the work which is required to be done by a contract worker. So always draw that line as a principal employer. And of course, as I mentioned to you, do be mindful of the fact that these tests will continue to apply as has been in the past when it comes to contract workers actually claiming permanency akin to that of your regular employees.
Understood. So, sir, I think we have covered most of the questions. There are some ancillary questions also, but we have touched upon almost all of them. So, I think
somebody asked a very pertinent question. What is the fourth labor code? So that is the Code on Wages 2019.
Yes.
Which we have, as I mentioned at the outset. That was a question which was asked, which we have not covered because we have already deliberated on that at length, and which is yet to be in force. Just to let you know, the Code on Wages 2019 received the presidential assent, but is yet to be in force. So we are expecting all the four codes to come into force at the same time. That's how the Union Minister of Labour and Employment has been really projecting it.
Right. So I think we have just received another question, and it's an important one, which is as far as office bearers of a trade union are concerned, or even the members of a trade union, can an outsider be part of the trade union? Has the law changed on that front?
You want to cover that point?
Yes, so the law remains the same. The Trade Unions Act also allows for workers who are not part of a particular establishment to be part of the trade union. So that provision has not been changed under the existing code as well. So yeah, that's about it.
In fact, that was the point which was fought and resisted tooth and nail by almost all the umbrella trade union organizations, because essentially that gives a lot of leeway to several political outfits and trade union organizations to continue to intervene in the internal affairs. And I think that continues. So you can have an external trade union, you can have an external member being a part of the trade union. You need not necessarily have to be an employee of the organization to become an office bearer. So that's something which is going to be the case, and we are yet to see if at all we can consider a reform which can be considered to be a sea change, in terms of how we can look at lack of political intervention for the future industry.
All right. Okay, there is one question that has been coming up for a while now, which is once the central government publishes rules, will the state government be allowed to come up with their own rules? I think we have already clarified that during the presentation, that the appropriate government is defined under each of the codes, and the definition is similar. So as far as banking, insurance, telecommunication, these companies are concerned, the appropriate government is the central government. So it will come up with rules governing these kinds of establishments. Of course, the central government also has certain general powers which the state governments do not have, which is prescribing the wage ceiling for application of chapters relating to EPF and ESI. But barring those aspects, a lot has been left to the appropriate government, which includes state government for rest of the private establishments. And so, for example, when it comes to work hours, so while the code, the OSH code provides that the daily working hours would be 8, but then other provisions have been left to the appropriate government, which, as I said, would be state government for several private establishments. So yes, both the central and the state governments will come up with their respective rules. So, but of course, it's the central government which is proposing to come up with its rules by December this year. And it appears that the states may follow suit, and some of the provisions could be replicated in the respective state rules as well.
All I can say, and just to add, because I'm looking at several questions about what are the formats, forms, so on and so forth. All of us will have to realize that what we are seeing today is going to have an all-encompassing, overbearing impact on how we used to look at labor laws. Almost the entire 44 labor legislations, which were as old as the British time or even prior to that, or even at the pre-independence time or post-independence time, have now been substituted or meant to be substituted by these 4 codes. So we will have to see how the state machinery or machinery at the central government level is going to react to it. Just to let you know, when we had some discussion with some of the officials at the state and central level, everybody said, don't ask me, I have no idea what's going on. We will come up with all the rules. This is how things are going to be, and we will streamline the processes, wait for it to come in, and until then, the government will not immediately annul what has been there. So please be mindful of the fact that unless and until, and of course you need to watch out for any specific developments, but it's not going to be the case that immediately everything is going to be substituted and annulled.
Right, and each of these codes have a savings clause that protects the notifications that have been issued. So for example, someone asked about IT establishments, whether the exemption given to them from standing orders will continue. So if there's any existing notification issued by any state government, so it is likely that it would be saved by virtue of this savings clause under the code.
Right. Sorry, Deepak, you have some comment on that.
Just to add on to this point, that it's not as plain and simple that all the existing laws will get subsumed and will all the notification under those will be replaced by this, whatever is coming. And just to add to what Diksha also mentioned, the definition of the factories, what factories and the threshold for factories, which is 20 and 40 now, it has a proviso which says that in case if any of the existing states have provided or stipulated thresholds which are higher or lower than what is prescribed under the OSH code, those will continue to apply until the time the state government harmonizes and brings them up in line with what is a prescription under the OSH code. State appropriate government again is under the OSH code again becomes a state government in respect of all your factories which are situated in a particular state and all establishment which are not covered by the central government as such. So a residuary clause is defined to include that state government will be the appropriate government for all establishment, factories and everything to which the central government is not the specified government. So it's not as simple that everything which is there will get taken out, but the existing systems and scenarios are thought to be taken care of under these new codes, and they try and bring as much harmony and introduce new system without disrupting what have been the existing practices.
Right. So that is all from our side, Rao Sahib sir.
Diksha, just one more question. I think this was, Anshul, we had discussed previously during when the wages code came in and the concept of revised definition of wages came in, and a new concept of in the inclusive components have to be up to 50% of the total remuneration for computation and of any benefits under the wages code. And that is something which has been carried over in these 3 codes, which is a welcome step. There's a lot of confusion which came in previously also whether the HR professionals need to revise the salary structures, and because that large organization that becomes a cumbersome exercise. So just to add on to that is what we previously advised, that it's not necessary that for you to revise the wages structures as such, but of course for the applicable thresholds and applicable components, contributions, and wherever it is applicable in terms of wage, the definition of wages comes into play, you will need to consider the components which are there and then accordingly contribute.
Sure.
Ankita.
I think Ankita is on mute.
Yeah. Yes, I was on mute.
No, I had muted all the participants, so she got also on mute.
That same.
Yeah.
Okay, so as expected, like as I started with, whenever it comes to anything to do with statutory compliance, labor laws, we all are very much in different kinds of ambiguities because there is different things which floats around in the industry and we get to hear, which creates confusions at time. And I, being an HR, also got victim of the same multiple times. So thank you so much, Anshulji, Deepakji, for adding such clarity in such simple words, I would say, because whenever it comes to law, I'm very scared because the kind of jargons which is being all the time used. So I would actually put this on behalf of all the participants that you have explained the entire thing in a very simple word, which was very easy to understand for all of us. And I believe that even all the participants, most of them were also sharing that the same thing, that it has been such a wonderfully explained and it was one of the most needed session which has been organized. So thank you so much on behalf of the entire HRFI team. Thank you, Diksha. You have reduced half of my job today for collaborating all the question answers wonderfully. And there are a few more questions which is coming still from the participants. I would request all of them to please write it to the HRFI ID, which has already been shared in all our group, so that we can post that queries to our speakers and we'll fetch back the answers and share it with you. As far as adding you to the groups are concerned, please send across a message in the number which I have shared in the chat box. You'll be added to the HRFI group. Coming back to the speakers, there is a lot of requests which is coming from all our participants, and I believe that this is the same thing which me, Rao Shahab and Mr. Deepak were discussing, that we have to do a phase 2 and phase 3 of it, because there is so much request and so many people are requesting for the same. So thank you once again, Rao Shahab. I would request if you please, sir.